Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 29th of June. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 126 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will run through the headlines for you. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and we will then together look at the statement by the First Minister yesterday and the reactions that we've seen to that statement today. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russian leader Vladimir Putin on Tuesday of becoming a terrorist, leading a terrorist state, and urged Russia's expulsion from the United Nations. In a virtual address to the UN Security Council, Zelensky urged the UN to establish an international tribunal to investigate the actions of Russian occupiers on Ukrainian soil and to hold the country accountable. The Ukraine president also called for the United Nations to visit the site of a missile strike on a shopping mall in the city of Kremenchuk. At least a missile strike on a residential building in Ukraine's southern city of Mykolaiv on Wednesday. Russia has claimed to have destroyed a training base for foreign mercenaries near Mykolaiv in its latest military operational briefing. Fighting continues in all settlements of the Lysychansk community, according to Sergei Haidai, Ukraine's governor of Luhansk. The shelling continues constantly. The destruction is catastrophic, he said. Finland and Sweden will be invited to join NATO at its Madrid summit after Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Tuesday lifted his opposition to their joining. The NATO General Secretary, Jens Stoltenberg, has said that he expected a swift ratification of Sweden and Finland's membership of the military alliance. Stoltenberg also said that the alliance's new strategic concept will state clearly that Russia poses a direct threat to our security. Zelensky will address the NATO summit in Madrid virtually today. NATO allies will continue to supply Ukraine with weapons in its war against Russia for as long as necessary, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said in Madrid. In an interview with the NBC network in the US, Volodymyr Zelensky has compared scenes he saw in Bucha to a war movie, saying, "It was just so quiet. Everything was destroyed. Dead people, destroyed army equipment. There was this sense of death. When they found people in the bottom of wells, hands bound, raped and murdered, they'd done everything to them. I just didn't know this could be done by people who, 30 years previously, we had lived together in the Soviet Union, in one country. I just never had thought that humanity could be capable of this, and this changes how you look at people." And now, with a quick look at the headlines at Scotland and elsewhere around the world, speaking to Andrew Marr on LBC, Anas Sarwar has said a Labour government would not take us back into the EU. This is an apparent U-turn from Mr Sarwar, who had supported European Union membership and remaining part of the single market and customs union, and of course, it is also at odds with the views of the majority in Scotland, who voted 62% to remain in the EU. The Labour Party's mantra of vote Labour to vote out Boris Johnson has been called into question after two Labour councillors were suspended by the party for refusing to support a deal between the Labour and Tory groups on Edinburgh Council. The Labour Party suspended the two Edinburgh Labour councillors yesterday after they refused to vote for a deal between Scottish Labour and the Tories, which allowed both parties to form an administration in our capital city, despite the SNP being the largest group on the council. About 7 million struggling families in the UK are living through a frightening year of financial fear, going without food, heating, toiletries and even showering as they try to cope with the cost of living crisis, a leading charity has said. Many people are falling deep into debt as they try to stay afloat, using credit cards or cash from loan sharks to pay for food and other basics, and building up arrears on energy bills, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, an anti-poverty charity. The extent of the crisis facing low-income households was so serious that more than 2 million households were no longer choosing between heating or eating because they had already gone without both, the charity said. A record investment of £8.5 billion has been committed to support low-income households over the period between 2018 and 2022, with almost £3.3 billion directly benefiting children. The fourth annual progress report on child poverty, published today, shows that all of the actions committed as part of the first Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, Every Child, Every Chance, have been delivered. The plan focused on three drivers of child poverty reduction: work and earnings, social security, and household costs, and on the six priority family types at the greatest risk of poverty, including lone parent families and families with a disabled adult or child. Key achievements over the life of the plan include the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, with more than 1.2 million payments between February 2021 and March 2022, a £58.6 million investment, an increase in the number of real living wage accredited employers, with the proportion of people earning the real living wage or more rising from 80.6% in 2018 to 85.6% in 2021, an increase in the funded hours for early learning and childcare from 600 hours in 2018 to 1,140 hours in August 2021, saving families up to £4,900 per eligible child in 2021, the delivery of 35,095 affordable homes, 25,562 of which were for social rent, supporting an estimated 11,585 households with children into affordable housing between 2018 and 2022. The extension of concessionary travel to all under 22s, with approximately 930,000 young people eligible for support, saving families up to £3,000 by the time their child turns 18, and an expansion of universal free school meals to children in primaries 4 and 5, saving families around £400 per child, and increasing the school clothing grant to at least £120 for eligible primary school children and £150 for those in secondary school in 2021. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the Secretary of State for International Trade, has been accused of deliberately avoiding scrutiny over the proposed UK-Australia Free Trade Agreement after she pulled out of giving evidence at the International Trade Committee for a second time, just as she was due to appear in front of fellow MPs and committee members who had already taken their seats. The SNP Shadow International Trade Secretary Drew Hendry MP warned the Australia trade deal would hammer Scottish farmers and flood markets with cheap, lower quality agricultural produce. The SNP has accused the Conservative Party of bribery, dishonesty and threats after controversial legislation which risks tearing up chunks of the Northern Ireland Protocol passed its second reading in the House of Commons. Despite clear internal resistance to the bill and speeches in favour of the opposition from former Tory Northern Ireland secretaries and former Prime Minister Theresa May, not one Conservative MP voted against the legislation. Following this, a Conservative MP was reported by Politico to have described a combination of veiled threats about losing the whip, political honours being dangled, and an ability for the government to dupe MPs by lying openly about a quite technical bill. And this was in order to quell any lingering resistance within Tory ranks and to ensure the legislation progressed to the next stage. In an open letter to Simon Case, the UK's Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service, Richard Thompson MP, the SNP's Northern Ireland spokesperson, has highlighted the allegations and called for a Cabinet Office investigation into the matter. The Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa has said she will challenge an order shutting down Rappler, the news website she co-founded, vowing that the outlet will not succumb to harassment and intimidation. Rappler, which has been widely praised for scrutinizing the administration of the outgoing Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte, has faced relentless legal charges and investigations. The latest case relates to an allegation that Rappler violated restrictions on foreign ownership in media, a claim that Rappler denies. Last year, Maria Ressa and the Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. In the House of Commons today, the SNP MP Carol Monaghan led a 10-minute rule bill urging the UK government to grant asylum seekers the right to work. Carol Monaghan's bill builds on the work of Lift the Ban, a 26-member strong coalition of charities, trade unions, businesses, faith groups and think tanks, in calling for the right to work for those seeking asylum unconstrained by the shortage occupation list after 6 months of lodging their claim. If passed, the bill would bring significant benefits to the economy and help vacancies in industries experiencing recruitment challenges such as hospitality, air travel and haulage. A new campaign to recruit more GPs to come to Scotland has been launched. The initiative includes targeted print and digital advertising and is part of the Scottish Government's commitment to increase the number of GPs by 800 by 2027. It aims to attract GPs to Scotland from other areas of the UK and elsewhere, building on a range of measures, which also include increasing undergraduate placements, looking at training placements to boost future capacity, incentivising moves to rural practice, and providing a wide range of development and support opportunities for GPs throughout their careers. And Scotland's Baby Box has been refreshed in time for its 5th anniversary. The new look box has updated clothing designs and now also includes a baby toothbrush to support early oral health. Every newborn baby in Scotland is entitled to a baby box, with around 222,450 delivered to families since the scheme began in August 2017. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Mike Russell. Mike was an SNP MSP more or less continuously between 1999 and 2021, when he retired from our Parliament. He was the first full-time Chief Executive of the SNP. He has held several cabinet posts in the Scottish Government, including having responsibility for dealing with Westminster over Brexit. And in November 2020, he was elected to the honorary position of SNP President. Mike has written several books, is a Professor of Scottish Culture and Governance, and he's joining us from Cowell this evening. Mike, good evening. How are you keeping?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you, on a sunny, unusually sunny evening in Glendaruel. It's not been much of a summer, but we've been encouraged by yesterday's announcement to view everything as being very sunny, and now we've got a big job to do to win independence, which will produce even better weather, I'm sure.
The sun is always shining in Argyll, obviously. We won't hear anything against it. So, Michael, we're lucky enough to have you here this evening to discuss yesterday's announcement by the First Minister. Yesterday we heard a date for a referendum, a route map to the referendum, a bill, and a preemptive reference to the Supreme Court. In terms of what you've seen and heard today in response to what happened yesterday, what has stood out for you in the way in which, for example, the print media or the news media has responded to yesterday's statement by the First Minister?
I think the opposition parties and certain sections of the media are unable to rise to the occasion, but that's not exactly a surprise. What they want to do is to talk about process all the time. What they don't want to do is to engage with the substantive issue of Scotland becoming an independent country and the arguments for that. And there will be arguments from unionists against that, and that's the type of debate we need to have. But if they succeed in keeping it entirely on process, then those arguments never take place. And that is what they wish to do. And we've seen some of that tedious approach today. But I think yesterday was a very important moment because it wasn't just a single announcement, it was a package of announcements. And it essentially wrapped up the process issues and said that is how we are going to deal with them. It is entirely clear how they should be dealt with in terms of setting a date for a referendum, wishing to hold that referendum either by a Section 30 order, which has been applied for again, or by a decision of the Supreme Court that it is within competence. Preempting that in terms of people bringing that as an issue by a Lord Advocate's reference and saying that is our preferred route. But if that route is closed off by Westminster, and it is by Westminster decision, by Westminster legislation that it would close it off, then we will endeavour to have an answer to the question by means of an election. And we've got to remember what we're talking about is an expression of will. what constitutionally what requires to happen, internationally what requires to happen in terms of recognition of a wish for independence is an expression of will. It is an expression of popular will in Scotland is required to have. Now, we have said since 1999, I think the election in 1999, that we would wish to do that through a referendum. But if that is not possible because of the blocking by a Westminster government, which was never meant to happen. I mean, I'm old enough to have been around when the Section 30 process was being discussed, and this is meant to be confirmatory, not a veto. But the arrogance of the Tories knows no bounds. We're now in a position where they treat it as a veto. But that can't be done. Then it can be done by another will. So I think that's a really important moment. It's the whole thing together. It deals with the process issues, and now we can get on and argue the case for independence. And the case for independence is stronger than ever. And as a result of Brexit, I think it is unanswerable, actually.
Thanks, Mike. Firstly, I know that you've been at the heart of many, many political campaigns over the years. And without giving anything away, how do you think that this Indie campaign might be different to the one, excuse me, to the one that we went through last time, if it will be different at all?
Yes, I think it will be different. I mean, I think last time, there's a variety of differences. One is last time it was something that we were promising and talking about, but it was set against the status quo, which people knew. There is no status quo. Brexit blew the status quo away. I mean, Michel Barnier said that at a very early stage in the Brexit negotiations. So there's no status quo. So this is a question of what actually a choice between two unions. A choice between the UK, which is a union which incorporates Scotland and which does not give Scotland any degree of power or influence, and a union joining the European Union, which is a union that will give Scotland considerably more power and influence and will allow Scotland to willingly pool its sovereignty. I think one of the most profound things I saw somebody saying yesterday was to say that actually, if there is so much difficulty and so much dubiety about how a member of a voluntary union can leave it, then you wouldn't want to be in that voluntary union. And that is a huge difference there. I mean, you look at the issue of the UK, it could. There was a mechanism for it to leave the EU, a clear mechanism. I'm sorry it took it. I think it was very, very wrong that it took it. But there was that clear mechanism. So, that's a big difference. There's another difference too. Politics has moved on. We have a government at Holyrood that consists of two parties, and quite rightly, in those circumstances, they don't agree on everything. So there will be a diversity of view in the debate, and that's healthy. So one of the things I'm concerned with, and have been concerned with for some time, is how we create a new yes movement, which reflects that diversity, allows for that diversity, and equally allows an invigorating and positive campaign to emerge that is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's the whole idea of a yes movement. So I think it will be different. I think those of us who were deeply involved in 2014 knew how positive it was, and I set myself the task here in Argyll of trying to speak in every village hall. I don't think I actually spoke in every single one, but I got pretty close to it. And I remember those meetings with enormous affection and enthusiasm. And one of the things I'm looking forward to is doing that sort of thing again. Last Thursday night, I spoke in Grangemouth at a yes meeting, and that was, in my view, the first of those meetings, the first of that campaign getting underway. And I look forward to those meetings and to the debate and discussion that takes place at them. And the choice that the people of Scotland will have, to create government anew from the foundations, as John Adams, the second American president, put it. That is the amazing task that we can choose. That we can choose to begin government anew from its foundations and build as we choose. That's a huge opportunity, and that's the enthusiasm we need to inject and to spread throughout the country.
Thanks, Michael. As it happens, last night I was discussing with Siobhan Tolland, who's now an SNP councillor in Dundee, and we were discussing the possibility of, as you say, building a new nation and building for the future rather than looking to the past. And we were discussing the option or the possibility of the recasting and the representation of a social contract for Scotland, again in contrast to the way in which I think it's fair to say the social contract that existed after the Second War across the UK has been resolutely torn up over the last 30 years. Do you think that that kind of approach, that kind of vision for the future is something that will form part of the campaign?
Yes, I do, and there'll be a number of visions for the future, not just one vision for the future, and that's really important. We've got the opportunity here to debate and discuss those visions, but the one certainty of it all is that none of those visions can be achieved unless we have independence, and that's a core message for the coming campaign. No matter how we envision the type of Scotland we wish to live in, and we will all have views on that, those can't happen while we're still part of the UK. That simply will not happen. Anything we choose to do will be and can be outvoted. We've seen ourselves dragged out of the EU. That's something I never thought would happen. So it is the ability to make the changes we wish to see, whatever those changes are, that is a big issue in independence. And that's what we will have to move towards and to debate and to discuss. We also need to reassure those people who are nervous about the process. So not everything can or should happen at once. We need to, and work is ongoing on this, as many people know, we need to frame a transitional constitution that takes Scotland from the moment of choosing independence through to the establishment of a new written constitution by means of a citizens' assembly type process, which has been obviously the SNP for a long time, and I think others support it too. So that there's detailed work to be done there, but nothing can happen. There can be no changes unless we choose to be independent. That is a key to the door, which opens up the possibility of the Scotland that each of us seeks. And then we can negotiate and discuss amongst ourselves exactly what that looks like. But one thing that is certain is it will be substantially better than the Scotland we live in now, because that Scotland is circumscribed by decisions made outside the country by people we did not elect and with whom we have not voluntarily pooled our sovereignty.
Thanks, Michael. One more question before we move on to looking at this from another couple of perspectives. In terms of the campaign, we've heard a great deal over the last few days, and actually the last few weeks, from unionist politicians, both north and south of the border, saying that now is not the time, and giving the implication that that everything else needs to be fixed before independence can be considered, almost suggesting that in some way independence is the cherry on the cake rather than the foundation of the cake, if I can mix my baking metaphors horribly. So do you think, will this idea that that now is not the time, everything needs to be fixed first, is that going to be is that going to be taken on and dealt with head on?
So, and it is already being dealt with head on, because the answer to that is we have to stop the rot. If we say, well, we put it off for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, apart from that being politically stupid, we would actually be continuing to decline. We are now part of the United Kingdom, which is declining. It is, in comparison to other states, a poorer country. It is a third country in EU terms. It is a country whose trading relationships are failing. It's a country that is challenging and breaking the law internationally. Is a country, frankly, that if we continue hitched to, we will ourselves continue to decline. And it will be progressively harder for us to join back in to the EU, which we were a member of for 47 years, and we observed the acquis. So actually, now is the time. Now is absolutely the time. And had it not been for the pandemic, earlier would have been the time. I mean, I was constitutional secretary and wanting to see this happen in 2020, 2021. But the pandemic made that impossible. So now is the time. Now is absolutely the time. And if we reject that argument, then we condemn ourselves and our children and our grandchildren to further decline and to further distance from prosperity and to further distance from the positive effect of working with others, which is the nature of the international community and the EU.
Thanks, Mike. I thought that was the approach that you would take, but I'm still very glad to hear it. Now then, we should look at the campaign and look at where we are, perhaps from a different perspective for a moment, because some of us saw and heard how the First Minister dealt with John Kay on BBC Breakfast this morning. I think it's fair to say that she responded very directly and robustly to his frankly thoughtless questioning. As the campaign gets rolling after yesterday's statement, how do you think people should be dealing this time around with politicians who have nothing to do with Scotland, journalists who know nothing and have nothing to do with Scotland, and also those who fund both those politicians and those journalists, and who also have absolutely nothing to do with Scotland, but seem to be determined that we should listen to them.
Well, we should deal with that robustly. I mean, I don't think anybody would accuse me of failing to be robust, and I was delighted to see the First Minister, as ever, being very robust and polite in her responses. I think this is a matter for debate and discussion, and if we can have that debate on the basis of the advantage to Scotland, on the policies that are be involved, on the national, international, and global issues involved, well and good. If this starts by belittling Scotland, I was fascinated by Malcolm Rifkin's response yesterday. Malcolm's an intelligent man, and to talk about Scotland being little and lonely is just pejorative nonsense. And I'm quite happy to say to Malcolm that is pejorative nonsense. One remembers Hugh McDernand's remark: "Scotland small, infinite Scotland small." This is just nonsense and rubbish. Now, Malcolm is a sentimental unionist. He can't imagine something different. But we need to be very blunt about that, and come and engage on the basis of facts. I understand that there will be politicians in Labour, in the Tories, in the Liberal Democrats who think they can just sneer at Scotland. That will not do them any good at all. I mean, both outside Scotland and within Scotland. What we want is an engagement on the issues and the serious issues that need to be resolved. And I think on that basis, the case for independence is unanswerable. I mean, I think George Monbiot put it very well some weeks ago when he simply looked at the decline that was taking place in the UK and said it's really time to get out. I mean, last time this was a narrow and well fought debate, and in the end, it swung on a number of issues. The European issue, which is no longer available to the UK, quite the reverse. It is a negative issue for the UK. And it swung on the vow, which were further promises to be made, many of which have not been kept. So I think we can also point to that. I'm always struck something I wrote about some weeks ago in my national column, which is always a key thing for me. When you look back at the arguments, not just the arguments from the British state about independence for countries such as Malta and even the United States in the 18th century, and India, they couldn't possibly afford it. It couldn't happen. Democracy, no democracy could be established. But actually, you look at the arguments in 1979 for the devolution referendum, when there was, I think the Express said, if devolution took place, then Ravenscraig would close, and Bathgate would close, and Dounreay would close. Well, all those things happened, but they happened because we were not able to defend ourselves during the period of Thatcher's rule. And we saw the same sort of arguments emerging in 1997. We saw the same arguments emerging in 2014. But the reality of the scare stories and the smears is that the bad things happen because Scotland does not choose to change, rather than it chooses to change. And I think we should make that point very strongly and with facts. And the facts are clear.
Thanks, Michael. There's an interesting point you're making there about projection. As you say, during the Brexit campaigns and during the last independence campaigns, everything that the Unionists or the pro-Brexit or the Brexiteers threatened people with have all come to pass. So I think we'll come back to this as the campaign unfolds. But you were talking there for a moment about the sneering from some politicians, and I was reflecting on this. The Tories and their bedfellows, the Labour Party, seem to insist on viewing everything through a lens of Westminster politics. Craig Hoy was on the TV yesterday wittering on about what he called grubby deals being done at Holyrood, when anyone who understands anything about the Scottish Parliament knows it's configured to make majority administrations very nearly impossible because it operates in proportional representation. And I was wondering if that was because the Tories have been so very, very far from anything approaching power in Scotland for so very long that they don't seem to understand how Holyrood works. But this Westminster lens through which apparently most unionist politicians and very nearly all political commentators view and assess everything, do you think that lens going to be a problem for the independence campaign, or will it be an asset?
Well, we should insist upon having this argument on the terms of what's best for Scotland, not what's best for Westminster, and not what's best for the Scottish Tories. I think you only had to watch yesterday's announcement to see how what disarray the Unionist parties were. I mean, Craig Nitley, I slightly know because he was a councillor, I think, in East Lothian when I was cabinet secretary for education, and then I think for the constitution. But these people they have nothing to offer. What does Craig Hoy have to offer Scotland? He's a member of a party that Scotland has not elected to government since 1955, since I was 2 years old. I think there's that famous remark from Attlee. I can't remember to whom. A period of silence would be in order. If the Tories want to come and discuss the virtues of the Union and set those virtues against the issues of independence, that's a debate that we can have. If we're going to be lectured, smeared, sneered at by people like Craig Hoy, I'm not interested in engaging. They have nothing to offer. There are far better uses of my time and Scotland's time. I've been involved in recent days in a Twitter dispute with Alistair Carmichael. I've known Alistair Carmichael for many years. I mean, both of us have been around Scottish politics for a long time. I don't dislike Alistair. I've worked with him on some issues. But he seems obsessed with the idea that in some way he can smear me and Angus Brendan McNeill and the First Minister as being anti-European, anti-internationalist. This is nonsense. I mean, anybody who knows us, anybody who knows our record shows that to be true. We really have to say to people like Alistair, if this is the nature of your debate, you have nothing to offer. Absolutely nothing. And we're not going to engage with that nonsense. We're just going to ignore it. I think we have to assert what we know to be true, argue those points which are useful to argue and to listen to others to, but not to put up with the type of rubbish that we've heard from a succession of Tories and Liberals and Labour, and absolutely to reject the position that they've found themselves in, and it's a position we should discuss. That now the pro membership of the EU parties are the independence parties, and astonishingly, a party like the Liberal Democrats, which had essentially its foundation desire to be part of the EU, its recent foundation, are now anti-EU and pro-Brexit. That is a major fault line, and it's one that needs to be exposed.
Thanks, Michael. You were talking about Tory politicians there for a moment, and we'll deal with Mr. Carmichael as well in a moment as well. But yesterday, it's probably fair to say that Douglas Ross was showcasing his talent for original thought by repeating and going on and on about illegal and pretend referenda, moments after hearing that the referendum will not go ahead without either Westminster Agreement or confirmation of legality from the Supreme Court. So the independence referendum will be neither pretend nor illegal, despite what Douglas Ross says it will be. And it struck me that, as I think you've indicated already, this is perhaps a symptom that all of the unionist parties, but in particular the Tories, have perhaps been outflanked or caught on the hop here, and that they are unable. They've been unable to respond in any meaningful way. How long do you think that Douglas Ross and Anas Sarwar and the likes of Alistair Carmichael are going to remain so completely on the back foot about all of this?
Well, you should never underestimate your opponents. I mean, I'm sure there are people even now who are looking at this, unionists, and saying this doesn't do. We need to do better than this. But it's not just being caught in the hop. What is their answer? Where is the boasted advantage, if I may quote Burns, of the union? What is it doing for us? And when you weigh that in the balance against the alternatives, it is now the alternatives that are better for Scotland. And that's a very simple calculation to make. The first of the papers that the Scottish Government published 2-3 weeks ago, laid out the real situation in terms of comparisons with similarly sized countries in Europe to show that Scotland was doing substantially worse. And the only difference, of course, is that Scotland was dependent and not independent, and of course not a member of the EU. So this is clear and factual. And that's the points that we need to make. All the rest of it, it's noise. And as I grow older, I get less tolerant of that sort of noise. I just don't want to engage in it. because it's nonsense. There are good people on the unionist side who genuinely believe in the union. I do not, and I'm happy to engage in that way, but I'm not going to engage with those who can't keep up with the argument. And I think a substitute for argument is just to do Scotland down. I'm not going to get involved.
Thanks, Mike. And now you mentioned there the Why Not Scotland paper that was produced by the Scottish Government a couple of weeks ago. And I was wondering, hoping to ask you, will the message about how relatively badly off we are as a result of remaining part or being part of the Union, how that will get through to voters? I'm wondering whether it was perhaps too theoretical. I know that the First Minister spoke yesterday about the worst cost of living crisis in the G7, the second lowest growth rate in the G20, a government that stokes industrial strife, demonises workers, and is provoking a trade war. And she also spoke about businesses and public services who are struggling for staff because freedom of movement was taken away against our wishes. So, do you think? Well, is it reasonable to expect the information and, as you say, the factual, objective basis that's set out in the Why Not Scotland paper that will begin to cut through with voters?
Yes, and we have to have the techniques to make sure that happens. When the First Minister asked me a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, to provide some support to the party's independence work in my role as party president, one of the things I instituted, and SNP members watching this will know, is a regular email contact on issues of independence with members, so that we are sending out information that members could use and could use with their friends and neighbours to argue the case for independence. Now, at the end of last year, last November, working with Believe in Scotland and working with the National and the Green Party, we produced a newspaper with some of the arguments, and 1 million copies of that were distributed in Scotland, which was very encouraging. We've gone on with that, and as a response to the publication of the first paper, not only was there a mailing from the First Minister, but to emailing to all party members in her role as party leader. But there was a 4-page version of that paper summarising the paper distributed in branches, SNP branches and constituencies will be able to distribute that, have it printed, or individuals can send it by email, which summarises and popularises the message. And it is certainly my view that that needs to happen with all the information as we build that up over the next few months, so that that information is remorselessly and relentlessly presented to the people of Scotland, and we use our imaginations to do it in every possible way. And we need to make sure that we are doing that we are creating the arguments, putting the arguments across, and doing it directly too. I mean, we know that the opportunity to do that is limited. I'm appearing very happily appearing on a channel that is positive about the issues of independence. We have one newspaper that's positive about the issues of independence, the National, and I commend that. And then we have a whole host of media that are, at the very best neutral, and it's hard to find the neutral ones, and absolutely worse, poisonously against. And even ones, something like the Times. I mean, I think one of the most entertaining parts of the morning for me is when you open up Twitter and you find the editor of the Times in Scotland who has tweeted endless stories from the paper, nearly all of which are SNP bad stories. Now the Times was allegedly a newspaper of record. I mean, it's a newspaper of a stuck and broken record, which is determined to do down the SNP and to do down the normal idea of independence. That is, they're entitled to do so. We have a free press, but we're equally entitled to point that out, and also to say we really do want and need to directly communicate, because the media is not balanced and does not represent where the opinion is in Scotland. If you accept views on opinions are roughly 50-50 at the present moment, where is that balance shown in media, in print media, and in broadcast media? Of course, broadcast media are different because there is also a legal obligation on them, and we must also be very strong in trying to ensure that that legal obligation is met, and presently it is not met. And we have to be very clear about that. But, people are entitled to their views. I just think because the SNP and the issue of independence is not accurately represented in the balance of that, then we have to be more determined to get the message across directly to people.
Thanks, Mike. Now, I was going to talk to you for a moment about the, if I can put it, the Supreme Court component in the statement from the First Minister yesterday. And I asked the same question yesterday, but I'm particularly interested in your view because of your experience, for example, in dealing with the Brexit whilst you were still a cabinet secretary. Now, at the moment, the Scottish government is led by the First Minister. The Lord Advocate is Dorothy Bain QC, who's a woman. The Solicitor General is Ruth Charteris, and I'm not forgetting that Joanna Cherry QC has been writing and talking about these issues for a long time. And that struck me as being in contrast, perhaps, to 2014, where we had Alex Salmond as First Minister and the Lord Advocate was the Labour appointee, Frank Mulholland. So I was wondering about whether the dynamic in terms of the negotiations and in terms of the direction and implementation of the campaign might be different this time because it's being planned and directed and led on this occasion by a group of very, very talented women, and also putting that into the context of discussions and negotiations with Westminster, where I think it's, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we probably have the most misogynist Prime Minister we've had for many, many years.
Yeah, I think just on a point of accuracy, I think Frank Mulholland became Lord Advocate at the appointment that Alex Salmond appointed him Lord Advocate. He was, I think, an appointee as Solicitor General before that. So
That's
just to be
correct.
entirely accurate. Um, I think it's an interesting point of view. I certainly think that the style is very different and the content is very different, and I think that may be a very important element. I think I strongly supported Nicola's view that there should be a general gender balanced cabinet. I was part of that general gender balanced cabinet. I think the efforts that she has made and the party has made to recognise the issues of equality and equity are extremely important, and I think it is producing a much better type of Scotland. I'm also an enthusiast for the arrangement with the Greens, which I think is advantageous to us all, wherever we come from, and reminds us of the urgency of the climate emergency. And of course, I'm a former environment minister, and that does weigh heavily with me. And we're not talking about, let alone acting, as much as we need to on this issue. But the issue of the Supreme Court outcome is impossible to predict. I've spent too much of my life involved in issues of seeking legal opinion and seeing things through court from my days as party chief executive onwards. So it is impossible to predict. What I think is very important in the First Minister's statement, one of the many things important in the First Minister's statement yesterday, is a clarity about not just that, but what happens thereafter. In the branch diagram, which you can look at, and I think making this a devolution reference is a very sensible and important thing for the Lord Advocate to have done. And of course, then that puts the onus on the Supreme Court and also on the UK government to defend it.
Now, that's an interesting point, Mike. I was reflecting yesterday that the First Minister said it will be the fault of Westminster legislation, not the Supreme Court, if the bill is not rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. And she said that if the court disagrees with the Scottish Government, then the SNP will fight the next general election on a single question: should Scotland be independent? Now, it struck me that the First Minister was being very careful uh, to respect the position of the Supreme Court in the current UK Constitution, and it struck me that that is in sharp contrast to the way that many senior Tory politicians attack and belittle the work of the Supreme Court, the Tory press describing them as enemies of the people, and in the context of Westminster politicians hating the Supreme Court and seemingly about to be doing all that they can to clip its wings and restrict its ability to operate. I was wondering, do you think that there's a prospect that with a Tory government with a sufficient majority, that they might seek to affect the way in which the Supreme Court works in order to affect the decision that they get as a result of this application by the Lord Advocate?
Well, it's always possible. I mean, I wouldn't rule it out as an issue, but it wouldn't be my first concern. I mean, I think what you always have to remember about legislation is the terms of the bill. What does the bill say? And also, lawyers will look at what the Parliament intended. Now, when we look at the Section 30 issue, it is my contention, and I was there at the time, And I remember the arguments about the Section 30 process. My contention is, and it is my view, but I would back it up if I'm required to in detail in terms of recollection of discussion at the time, was that the SNP, remember, had not in June 1997 had not committed itself to support a two-question referendum, which the Blair government, newly elected Blair government, was intending to bring in. Labour wanted the SNP to support that. To be fair, and I was party chief executive at the time, and to be fair, the SNP wanted, in its leadership level, wanted to do that. But there had to be a guarantee that there was no glass ceiling. In other words, if the Scottish Parliament were to vote to move on to independence, that would not be specifically forbidden by the bill. What emerged out of that discussion and was eventually agreed in a meeting at which I was present, which Alex Salmond was there and Donald Dewar was there, and I believe Callum MacDonald may have been there as Dewar's PPS, was that there would be a mechanism by which, if a referendum was held, that would be confirmed by the Westminster Parliament, and there could then be a referendum on that issue, not vetoed, but confirmed. And that was the agreement which allowed the SNP to decide at its National Council in, I think, late June, early July 1997 to back the double yes movement. I don't think there would have been a willingness by the SNP, either at leadership level or at National Council, to do that if it had been that the Scottish Parliament would vote for that and then Westminster would consider whether or not to accept that. That would not have been, in my view, an agreement which could have led to the SNP participation. So my view is that the veto that May and then Johnson endeavour to wield, and which Cameron thought about wielding and in the end didn't wield and came to an agreement on the Section 30 order. But that veto is not implied by the legislation, in my view. Now, it may well be that the Supreme Court reading the legislation in a different way and not paying attention to that issue may come to a different view. That's entirely up to it. What I think is important is that if it comes to that view, we know what comes next, and we do know what comes next, and it will be as a result of Westminster legislation, and it will be as a result of Westminster legislation, in my view, being interpreted and operated in a way that was never intended. But in those circumstances, we can move on to the issue of an election, a Westminster election, which the question can be put.
Thanks, Mike. And just following on from the points that you were making there, and tying back a little to the question I asked earlier, at present we have a Tory government in Westminster, which apparently does not think twice about breaking the law, which is more than happy to disregard international obligations, including international obligations that the current Prime Minister himself negotiated and signed. And so, in the context of a Tory government or a Tory party that is, as I say, is more than happy to attack a number of the fundamental institutions of the Constitution in any country, but in this country in particular, for example, attacking the Supreme Court. So, in terms of you're saying that the deliberate misinterpretation or reinterpretation of the Scotland Act. Do you think that there's a risk here that the Unionist campaign will be led by or will be advised by those who will stop at nothing to prevent the democratic will of the people of Scotland from being implemented? For example, changing the way in which the Supreme Court operates, ignoring legislation, breaking international agreements. How significant do you think that risk is?
Prepared for them to behave in a thoroughly discreditable manner. Remember that when we passed the piece of legislation at Holyrood, which was it allowed us to follow on from European legislation, essentially our withdrawal bill. The UK changed the law after we had passed ours in order to try and rule our bill out. And they did it in a very sneaky way. We have protested because we know the Lord Advocate noticed it, but they did it in a way which the Supreme Court acknowledged, that our bill was not ultra vires, and that the one difficulty, and it was a comparatively minor difficulty, the one difficulty in it was caused by the fact that the Westminster government had changed the law after we had passed the bill. So that's what we're up against, and we're up against we're up against a lot of ignorance too. I'm always struck when you look at ministers in Scotland appearing in front of Westminster committees, and I've been through it myself, that there is a very limited knowledge of what has taken place in the last 20 odd years. Very few people at Westminster were around at the time of devolution. There is a truth in David Cameron's observation that they devolved and forgot. Civil servants didn't need to know about certain issues in Scotland because they were no longer involved in them. And for most of the Tory and some Labour members elected after 1997, and certainly after 2010, and a very substantial number have been, their understanding of devolution is that it's an SNP plot to get independence. I mean, they don't understand the whole process that was gone through, not just in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but actually they've not bothered to find out what happened, from the 1850s onwards and the establishment of the Society for the Vindication of Scottish Rights, the re-establishment of the Office of the Secretary of State for Scotland, the devolution bills that were passed before the First World War, the issue of Dominion status, all that means nothing to them. And they see everything through the prism of the current debate, and they don't understand where it comes from. And that's quite difficult to deal with. And indeed, that's been acknowledged by Westminster committees themselves. I mean, I was quite impressed, for example, by one of the PACAC committee, Westminster PACAC committee reports, which accepted that there was a shocking lack of knowledge. Now, the problem with this is every time it's pointed out, you will have Westminster MPs and others say, "Oh, we must do something about it," and nothing happens about it. It's the same sort of rhetoric as you get from the current UK government, which always says, we want the two governments of Scotland to work together. Well, no, they don't, because they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the current Scottish government. They don't acknowledge the mandate that exists, and on every possible occasion they will try and do it down. I mean, you saw the extraordinary spectacle of the Secretary of State for Scotland saying to an elected Scottish MP, "Suck it up." I mean, that was extraordinary. And that just defines Alistair Jack's position. And Alistair Jack, although he is, pretty much the worst Secretary of State that there has ever been, is also very typical of the arrogance of the current Tory government.
Thanks, Mike. Now, time was against us a little bit, so I wanted to look at this issue a little bit from a slightly international perspective. You mentioned before an approach is to read the bill and see what the bill says, and I very quickly did that yesterday afternoon, just because it's the right thing to do. So it struck me immediately that Section 3 of the Independence Referendum Bill talks about qualifying foreign nationals, who I think are those who previously would have been referred to as citizens of the EU. Now, the Section 3 of the bill expressly includes qualifying foreign nationals within the franchise for the referendum. How big an impact do you think that will make on the result of the referendum?
Well, I think it's important to whether or not it influences the result. I think the bill can only be read in the context of two other bills. One is a generic referendum Scotland bill, which lays out the arrangements for any referendum, and the other one is a franchise bill. And those are two bills that I took through when I was the relevant minister. And the franchise bill grants a very wide franchise, one of the widest franchises in the world, on residence, not on of citizenship, and that's the right thing to do. So I think that many citizens of other countries who have the right to vote in Scotland will look at this through their experience elsewhere and through the countries that they know, and will say, well, yeah, I know independent countries, they work well. I come from an independent country. Why on earth wouldn't this happen? There's a lot of misinformation about the EU in 2014, both this issue that we would not qualify as members, which is nonsense. But in addition to that, saying that people would have to leave, which was scaremongering. Now that they know that that's not true, and they now also know that the only parties which wish to rejoin and to re-establish the the vital necessity of freedom of movement, which works for both sides, works for you citizens, works for people who live in Scotland but can go and do things elsewhere. The only parties are the independence parties. I think that will have an effect.
Thanks, Mike. We've had a fantastic conversation this evening, and you've enlightened and illuminated a wide range of areas with regard to the roadmap that the First Minister set out in Parliament yesterday. But I'm afraid that that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. You will also find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter, because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, I will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and a very special thanks to our very special guest, Mike Russell. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as ever. Thank you.
I hope that you can join us here again on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.